So she wrote this almost 10 years ago, and she was ahead of the curve for a lot of questions we're finding ourselves facing now. So with that, thank you so much for coming out and visiting us. Welcome.
Hi. Wow, there's a lot of you here. Thank you so much, because it's such a beautiful day out. And I'm from upstate New York, and we've had like the longest winter in the history of winter this year. It's really cold, and it was like still snowing on like April 30th. So I almost didn't come today, so I'm amazed that you're here. So thank you so much for finding time. I know, you crazy people who live in this paradise. I don't even understand you. I want to start by thanking Lily especially for really reaching out and making sure I got here, and to Scott and to Tina as well, who like got my physical body here and made sure that I made it to the room and all of that really important stuff to being part of the conversation. And I'm really struck by what Lily read. For reasons that are good, which is like, oh yeah, I kind of had a point, okay. Like I wasn't totally off base 10 years ago. And I'm gonna say why I've been on base. And it actually has nothing to do with me being particularly smart. It has to do with the company I keep, and I'll talk about that a little bit. But the other thing that really struck me is that, man, I really wrote like an academic 10 years ago. And I'm not actually gonna subject you to that today, because I've actually, for the last several years, been writing primarily as an investigative journalist and a long-form journalist. And I'm really grateful for my academic training, and my disciplinary training has been really important to the kinds of questions that I ask and the way that I design how I look at the world. But as I hope you'll see, I believe my writing has gotten a lot clearer. That's something I'm actually really happy to talk about at the end if people have sort of professionalization questions, like why would you do something like that? I'm really happy to answer them, because I'm excited about writing and talking about this part of my life. So what I'm gonna do today, again, not an academic anymore, no PowerPoint. I'm gonna tell stories today. I'm gonna tell stories from the last 8 or 10 years of my reporting around technology and poverty in the United States. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about the 3 stories that I tell in my new book, which is called, as Lily said, Automating Inequality, How High-Tech Tools Profile, Police, and Punish the Poor. I'm going to tell you a little bit first about how I came to do the kind of work that I do. Then I'm going to tell you a little bit about the 3 stories in the book. Just sort of raise a couple of points that I think are important for this particular room to think about. And then I'm going to try to leave lots and lots of time for us to have a conversation, because it looks like there's a really smart room here. And then I have been told that the undergrads in the room leave at 5:10. So I'm going to make sure to leave room for you to get out when you want to get out. So what we're going to do is I'm probably going to talk for about a half an hour, maybe a little bit, just a touch more. But I'm going to rely on you when your energy is starting to flag, right, to let me know quietly. So happy fingers mean everybody's doing good. Like, you can keep going. We're having a great time. Middle fingers are like not middle fingers. Twinkly fingers on the horizontal, not middle fingers. That means, you're starting to lose us. It's hot in here and stuffy, and we're kind of getting bored. And downward fingers are like, Virginia, you lost track of the time. You've been talking for 90 minutes, and we really want to go home, okay? So up, middle, down. Great. All right, so I will check in with you on that as we go through the afternoon. So I want to talk first about how I came to do the work that I do, and specifically the work that went into the book, Automating Inequality. So in the year 2000, I come from a background in community technology movements and also eventually in economic justice and welfare rights. But I really started in community media and community technology. And I was very much of the opinion that one of the sort of key social justice issues of the new millennium was around access to technology and about how we manage different kinds and different modes of access for different kinds of folks. And one of the things that I did a lot of was to build collaborative technological resources like computer labs in low-income communities. So I started working in public housing. I moved, actually I started with an organization when I lived in the Bay Area in the mid-90s, and I'm gonna age myself out here a little bit. So like I wrote my first website for the Mosaic browser in 1995, so I'm super old. So I started doing this work in East Palo Alto in a community that actually no longer exists called Whiskey Gulch. It's now an IKEA and a conference center. It was a community when I worked there. We can get back to that too, if you want to talk about the role that this stuff plays in displacement. I think it's an interesting question. After that, I moved back east, so I live in a small city in upstate New York called Troy, New York, which is the finest small city in the country. I'm a big fan, and I worked there in public housing with youth. And then I started to work in a YWCA, which is a residential Y, which means it worked basically as a single room occupancy hotel. And I worked in this community of 9 poor and working class women who lived together in this space to co-design technological resources for the folks who lived in that community. And one day in the year 2000, I was sitting in the computer lab talking to one of the women who lived in the community, and she goes by a pseudonym in my books, and her pseudonym is Dorothy Allen. And Dorothy and I were just sort of shooting the breeze about technology. We got around to talking about her electronic benefits transfer card, her EBT card. And EBT cards are basically like these debit-like cards that you get public assistance benefits on. So if you get food stamps or if you get cash assistance, it comes on this debit card now. And I was saying, oh yeah, so Dorothy, people tell me they really like these, like they're more convenient. There's not quite as much stigma in the grocery store as there was when you were like busting out paper food stamps to pay for stuff. And she said, oh yeah, that's true. She said, you know, but also my caseworker uses my EBT card to track all of my purchases and all of my movements. And I must have had the super shocked look on my face, right? Because she kind of pointed at me and laughed for like a solid 2 minutes, just at how naive I was. There was a lot of that when I was working in this community, which is one part of the reason that I'm ahead of the curve on some things, is these very smart women schooled me really hard. And so Dorothy laughed at me for a long time. And then she got a little bit quiet, and she looked at me and she said, you know, Virginia, you all, meaning sort of professional middle class people, you all should pay attention to what's happening to us because they're coming for you next. Which I thought was incredibly generous of her, actually. And also incredibly on point. So this 18 years ago now. And I think one of the reasons that I have continued to be able to break some ground in the work that I do around technology and inequality, or around the ways we understand technology, is that if you look at technology in communities that I think of as low rights communities, as places where there's low expectation that people's rights will be respected, so that's folks on welfare, that's communities of color, that are highly policed, that's communities of undocumented migrants, right? Places where there's low expectation that people's rights will be respected, that's actually where the future arrives first, right? So there's this old science fiction saw, which is like the future is already here, it's just badly distributed. It's something like that, I'm paraphrasing. I agree with that, but I actually mean it the opposite way that they tend to mean it. So they tend to mean it like the future is unevenly distributed because rich people get the fancy stuff first. I mean it because poor and working communities become the targets of our most invasive and intrusive technologies first, because there's low expectation that their rights will be respected. So I really think Dorothy was really spot on when she said, hey, like pay attention to what's happening to those of us on public services, because you might see stuff like this showing up in other places. And I'm going to talk specifically towards the end about how there's some really specific ways that that's beginning to happen right now with a new presidential administration, and I want to talk about that a little bit. So one of Dorothy's lessons was start with the targets of these most intrusive and invasive systems, and you're going to learn something different than if you started with designers and administrators and computer scientists. Though I also interviewed all those folks for this book, I started with the folks who see themselves as the targets of these systems, and that's why I think the book's a bit different than other work in the field. So what am I talking about when I say, the folks I talk to or the stories I tell in this book? So I tell 3 big stories in automating inequality. One of them is about an attempt to automate all of the eligibility processes for the welfare programs in the state of Indiana. So that is cash assistance, or what's called TANF. There's a lot of acronyms, both in the technological work and in the social services work. So if you lose me on the acronyms, give me horizontal twinkles, and I'll back up. So that's the TANF program, which is cash assistance. That's food stamps. What was at the time called food stamps is now called SNAP, or Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program. And that's Medicaid, which is the health insurance program for low-income families. In Los Angeles, I talk about a system called the Coordinated Entry System. And coordinated entry has been called by its proponents the Match.com of homeless services. The intention of the system is to match some of the most vulnerable unhoused folks in LA with the most appropriate available housing resources. And I'll talk more about that in a moment. And in Allegheny County, Pennsylvania, which is the county where Pittsburgh is, I talk about a system called the Allegheny Family Screening Tool, which is a statistical model that's supposed to be able to predict which children might be victims of abuse or neglect in the future. So those are the 3 stories I tell in the book. So what I'm going to do is tell you a little bit about each of those technical systems. But what I want to make sure to do is connect my descriptions of what's happening in the infrastructure and the technology with how people who are targets of these systems feel about it, right? So I think one of the things that can be really hard to communicate in these books about technology and policy and inequity is actually what it feels like to be the target of one of these systems. So I want to make sure the folks who I spoke to for this book took enormous chances talking to me. So they all, because I'm writing as a journalist now, not as an academic, they all went on the record with their full names and their actual stories, right? So they took because particularly many of them are still in the public service system, they took enormous risk sharing their stories with me. So I want to make sure that their voices are in the room. It's really important to me. So let's start by talking about Indiana. So the system in Indiana started in, how are we doing? Twinkle up, twinkle down, twinkle down. No, we're still good. Oh, you guys are great. Thanks. Okay, so Indiana. So the system in Indiana started in 2006 when then Governor Mitch Daniels signed a $1.34 billion with a B billion-dollar contract with a consortium of high-tech companies, including IBM and Affiliated Computing Services, ACS, which I believe is now part of Xerox, to attempt to automate and privatize all of the eligibility processes for the state's welfare programs. And part of the intention behind the plan was the governor sort of did this barnstorming tour of the state to talk up this plan. And part of what he did is argue that not only could privatizing and automating a lot of these processes make the systems more efficient, but also that breaking the relationship between frontline social service caseworkers and the families that they served could act as a block to collusion and fraud. So the system was really intentionally part of this deep programming of the system was to break the relationship between caseworkers and the families they served. And what that looked like for caseworkers is that they were moved from local county offices where they worked for the state to these regional call centers that were run by ACS. They no longer had a docket, like a group of families that they served, that they saw the cases through from beginning to end, but instead they had a queue of tasks that dropped into their workflow management system, which was this computer system on their desk. So rather than responding to families that they had developed a relationship, often developed relationships with, that they were responding to whatever task dropped next into their queue, and it could come from anywhere in the state. And from the recipients or the applicant's side, what that looked like is if you had a problem with your application, And this is something that people are going to be really familiar with, this feeling of like, calling a call center and having to explain the problem over and over again to the new person, because there's never somebody looking across your case, right? There's never somebody who's responsible for it from beginning to end. So every time you called the help center, you spoke to someone new. It often meant that who was accountable and responsible for mistakes and their solutions was really unclear. And what that meant was 1 million benefits denials in the first 3 years of the experiment. Most of those denials were for this sort of catch-all reason of failure to cooperate with establishing eligibility. And basically what failure to cooperate meant is that someone had made a mistake somewhere in the process. Like it could mean that there's like a signature that you missed on page 34 of this 60-page application. It could be that the call center worker was applying policy incorrectly and made a mistake. Or it could be that the document center that was scanning the documents, right? You photocopied your driver's license and then faxed it to the document center, and then they scanned it into the document center. So like a bunch of the driver's license were just these like black boxes, right, that were illegible. So any of those mistakes could result in the decision failure to cooperate. And because that relationship between caseworkers and the families they served had been broken, then the only person who ended up being responsible for finding these problems and fixing them were the applicants themselves. And these were some of the most vulnerable people in Indiana, right? So folks who were really struggling to meet their basic needs for whatever reason, job loss, domestic violence, mental health crisis, right? Health crisis. So people who are already undergoing pretty tough times. Then became sort of cognitively responsible for finding the mistakes, whether they had made it or the state had made it. So they received a notice that just said, we found that you failed to cooperate, so you've been denied. Didn't say anything about what the mistake was, just that there was a mistake, and then left it up to applicants to figure out what the problem was. And I just want to share one story from Indiana with you. The book is actually dedicated, I'm not going to talk about Sophies Story, but the book is actually dedicated to a severely disabled little girl named Sophie Stipes, who is one of the folks who received a failure to cooperate notice addressed directly to her from the state of Indiana and lost her Medicaid during this time. But I'm going to tell the story of Omega Young for you guys. So in the fall of 2008, Omega Young of Evansville missed an appointment to recertify for Medicaid because she was in the hospital suffering from terminal cancer. The cancer that began in her ovaries had spread to her kidneys, breast, and liver. Her chemotherapy left her weak and emaciated. Young, a round-faced, umber-skinned mother of 2 grown sons, struggled to meet the new system's requirements. She called the Vanderburgh County Help Center to let them know she was hospitalized. That's one of those call centers I was talking about. But her medical benefits and food stamps were still cut off for failure to cooperate. Because she lost her benefits, Young was unable to afford her medications. She lost her food stamps. She struggled to pay her rent. She lost access to free transportation to medical appointments. And Omega Young died on March 1st, 2009. The next day, on March 2nd, she won an appeal for wrongful termination, and all of her benefits were restored. Okay, so that's Omega Young and the Indiana case that I talk about. So I want to talk a little bit about Los Angeles and about coordinated entry. So coordinated entry responds to this really incredibly intense human rights catastrophe that is the housing crisis in Los Angeles County, right? There are 58,000 unhoused people in Los Angeles County. So the city that I live in, Troy, it's a small city, but there's 50,000 people in my city. And so that's the entire city that I live in is homeless in Los Angeles, plus 10,000 people. Right? And 75% of them are completely unsheltered, meaning they're living in encampments or cars or just out on the street. So this is an extraordinarily difficult crisis to manage emotionally and intellectually. If you've spent any time in Skid Row or in the encampments of South LA, you know this. So it is with good reason that the designers of coordinated entry set about to try to find a way to create more efficiency and more clear decision-making in the homeless services system in Los Angeles County. And how they did that was create the system called the coordinated entry system, and that's made up of 4 sort of pieces. The first is a survey that's given in person to unhoused folks. It's got a terrible acronym. I warned you about these terrible acronyms. It is called the VISPEEDAT, which is the Vulnerability Index and Service Prioritization Decision Assistance Tool. It's not my first time saying that out loud. So the VISPEEDAT is the survey that unhoused folks take. The survey is then entered into their homeless management information system, which is a county-wide set of is a data. It's complicated. The technical part of it's a little bit complicated. It's not actually a database. It's a set of data standards, but let's just call it a database for ease of use. So they enter this data into the homeless management information system, and then they run 2 algorithms on it. The first algorithm ranks all of the unhoused folks based on their perceived vulnerability to some of the worst outcomes of homelessness. So that's death, that's mental health crisis, emergency room visits, lots of other really violence, community violence, lots of really awful things that can happen to unhoused folks. So it gives them a score between 0 and 17, 0 being not vulnerable at all, 17 being very vulnerable. And then it runs a second algorithm, which turns out isn't actually an algorithm, it's actually a person, but that's another story that I'm happy to talk about later, but is less important to the story today. So the second, we'll call it algorithm, which is supposed to match the most vulnerable unhoused folks to the most appropriate available resources. And that's not quite true because it actually serves folks at the top very well, where there are some resources for permanent supportive housing. It also serves folks at the bottom of the vulnerability scale pretty well, because that's where people can access the resources of what's called rapid rehousing, which is basically just these very much smaller amounts of money that are time limited to do things like interrupt an eviction or make sure that people get access to, can make it to apartment, like meetings with apartment managers. So it's a way of dealing with crisis homelessness, like when people have just become homeless because of domestic violence or a job loss or an eviction. So it serves people at the top and the bottom pretty well. But what that means is they've managed to survey about, as of the writing of this book, they managed to survey about 39,000 people with the VISPEEDAT, and they've managed to serve about 9,000 of those folks with some kind of resource. That doesn't mean an apartment, it doesn't mean a house key, it can just be this $200 to resist, to interrupt an eviction, for example. But that all goes under the category served in the system. So one of the things that's complicated about coordinated entry is that what then happens to those 30,000 people who are sort of in the middle, right? They're not vulnerable enough to trigger immediate assistance because they are the most vulnerable, and they're not strong enough on their own to sort of make a go of it with the limited resources of rapid rehousing. And so there's 30,000 people who are in that category who have taken the VISPEEDAT often several times and have, as time has gone on and they haven't been served with any resources, have come to look with some skepticism on this system. And the skepticism is not unwarranted, right? So one of the things people are really concerned about is who their data is shared with and how, because the VISPEEDAT asks some really intensely invasive questions. So, for example, it asks if you're having unprotected sex. It asks if you're trading sex for drugs. It asks if somebody thinks that you owe them money. It asks if there's an open warrant on you. They also ask where you can be found at different times of the day. They ask to take a picture. And folks do sign a very comprehensive informed consent form. But they actually have to request a sort of second set of forms if they actually want to know who their data is shared with. So you have to request the list of agencies that are part of the data sharing agreement, and then they have to be able to find you, and of course to get you that list, and of course folks are unhoused, right? So that's often complicated. So if you do manage to get the list, which I did, it turns out that there's 168 different organizations with whom all of that information is shared. And some, but not all of the information, actually under federal data standards can be shared with law enforcement, with the LAPD, just based on an oral request, meaning you don't need a warrant, you don't need oversight, you don't need a reason, you don't need to prove that this is part of an ongoing investigation. A beat officer can just walk into a social service organization and ask for this information out of the HMIS. Social service workers are not required to give it to them, but they are allowed to give it to them, right? And so folks who have given up this information over and over again and haven't seen any services have started to view this system pretty skeptically. And specifically, they've started to feel like they're being asked to incriminate themselves in exchange for a slightly higher lottery ticket for housing. And I want to tell you one of the stories of the folks I spoke to in Los Angeles. And he goes by the nickname Uncle Gary. His name's Gary Boatwright. So when I met Uncle Gary, he was living in a gray and green tent on East 6th Street on the edge of Skid Row. He's a straight-talking, wryly funny man with thinning white hair and Santa Claus blue eyes. He's held a dozen careers: welder, mason, paralegal, door-to-door salesman, law student, and most recently a document processor for a wholesale mortgage lender. Since moving to Skid Row a few years ago, Gary's filled out the VISPEEDAT 3 times, and he's lost patience with the process. He doesn't think he's scored very high. He's 64, and other than a little high blood pressure and a hearing problem, he's mostly healthy. Though he's known by some in the community as Commander Cush and keeps rum in a Mountain Dew bottle in his tent, his substance use doesn't seem abusive or debilitating. He's not sure what's in his mental health file that's in Orange County. In fact, he didn't even know he had one until a judge shared that he had a mental health diagnosis, but not what it was. So the problem, as he sees it, is not his comparative vulnerability, it's simple math. There's not enough housing in Los Angeles for this county's 58,000 unhoused people. So he said to me, people like me who are somewhat higher functioning are not getting housing. It's another way of kicking the can down the road. In order to house the homeless, you have to have the available units. Show me the units, otherwise you're just lying. So in November 2016, Gary was arrested. He was charged with breaking the window of a public bus with a plastic 99-cent store broom, which when he called me from Men's Central in LA, he said was physically impossible. When he got out actually several months ago, and when he got out, he had lost everything. He lost his tent, his paperwork, his relationships with local organizations, and his network of friends that kept him safe. And if he chooses to interact with the VISPEEDAT again, he'll actually score lower because the VISPEEDAT counts incarceration as being housed. So the model will see him as less vulnerable, and his priority score will slip even further. So that's Uncle Gary. Uncle Gary wants everybody to know that he's okay. I'm actually going to see him next week. He, bless him, when he read the book, emailed me to say wonderful things about the way I captured his life, which made me feel really good, and then went on to correct 2 really arcane details of housing policy in Los Angeles County, which I was like, oh, Gary, thank you for just blowing holes in all of our stereotypes about the unhoused. He was like, and another thing, let me tell you about 2118D. I was like, okay. He's doing all right. So the third story I tell in the book is about the Allegheny family screening tool. And I'm going to try to do this pretty quickly, though this is one of the more complicated, technically, systems that I talk about in the book, and I think is really complicated ethically as well. And then I think we're getting close to lull in energy time, so I think what I'm going to do is just sort of name 3 things that I think are important to... Lily's okay. How's everybody else doing? Oh, see fewer happy twinkle fingers. People are getting hot. That's okay. Okay, so I'm going to talk about the story. I'm going to raise sort of 3 points for us to talk about, and then we're going to move to conversation. Okay, so in Allegheny County, I worked on this, reported on this system called the Allegheny Family Screening Tool. And what's important to understand about this system is it's built on a data warehouse that was created in Allegheny County in 1999 that currently holds 1 billion records, which is more than 800 for every individual in Allegheny County. But it actually doesn't collect information or data equally on all members of the county. So the data warehouse is actually built on collecting regular data extracts from a variety of county and state programs that primarily serve poor and working families. So it is the County Office of Mental Health, the County Office of Drug and Alcohol, 20 public schools, the jails and prisons, juvenile and adult probation, and the State Office of Income Maintenance, which is the Pennsylvania's welfare office. So it receives these data extracts regularly from all of these different programs. And the tool that I'm talking about, the Allegheny Family Screening Tool, is built on top of that data warehouse. It turns out that that's really important because it has, that data set has very specific limitations to it that are important. This is a pretty technical crowd, so I'll give you a little bit of the down the rabbit hole on the technical parts of this stuff. One of the things that's really interesting about the Allegheny Family Screening Tool is it's written about a lot as if it's machine learning or artificial intelligence. It is not. It is, in fact, a Probit regression. So it's a pretty standard and stable model. It's not learning, and it actually has to be manually updated. They have to manually update the data and rerun the model. And I think that's important because often we talk about these systems as if they're much more difficult to understand than they actually are. And I think it's a form of math washing that makes it feel like it's hard to understand this stuff. And there are some things that are tricky, but this is not so hard to understand. Like I think it's something that we all are perfectly capable of weighing in on. So I think it's important to sort of interrupt that like magical mythos of these super tools. So it's a Probit regression that was run on all of the variables that are available in that data warehouse. The regression identified 131 variables that the designers believe are highly correlated with future abuse or neglect of children. Because the database is built only really from information that's collected about poor and working families, it's not super surprising that a number of those variables are highly correlated with social class, with economic class, right? So a full quarter of them are just measures of whether or not you're poor. And then another quarter are measures of whether or not you've interacted with programs that primarily serve the poor, right? So about half the variables are basically just about whether or not you're poor. A couple of things that are important to note about this, or a couple of things that came up in conversations with community members who are targeted by the system. Folks identified sort of two major issues. One was a false positives problem, right? So particularly the parents of who might be targeted by the system, who might have this risk model run on their family, we're really concerned about false positives, which just means seeing potential harm where no actual harm exists. So they feel like because the system, the data set is so limited, that it actually is a kind of, it's much like predictive policing in that the model is built on a really limited data set that creates a feedback loop where because you are only looking at this limited or this, you're profiling part of the community, and then because you're profiling that part of the community, you find more instances, and that then becomes a feedback loop that feeds more profiling, more investigation, more instances, and it goes back around. So parents, I think understandably, felt like the system really confuses parenting while poor with poor parenting, and that it could create a system that over-surveils poor and working class families, and misses the kind of harm that you might find in other kinds of families. And that was the second sort of set of issues that folks raised for me around this system. And this mostly came from the intake call center workers. And those are the folks who basically sit in a call center and answer hotline calls, abuse and neglect hotline calls, and also receive reports from folks who are mandated by law to report any suspicion they have of abuse or neglect of a child. So there's folks like teachers, emergency room doctors, some in Pennsylvania clergy, after school program runners, nonprofit workers, folks like that are actually legally required to report any suspicion they have that abuse or neglect might be occurring. So intake call centers are the folks who receive all those reports and make decisions about which cases will go to a full child welfare investigation and which will get screened out, which means they either the accusations don't meet the definition of abuse or neglect, or the risk of harm seems real low. So this tool is supposed to supplement those intake call centers' decision making. And there's more to say about that, but I'm not going to say about it. I'm not going to talk about it right now. But I spent a day in the call center, spending time with these intake workers, watching them do their job and talking to them about what they thought was important. And one of the things that they raised around the model was that false positive problems clearly are an issue. It's clearly something particularly parents would be concerned about. But intake workers were really concerned about false negatives, which is not seeing harm where possible harm might exist. So they were particularly concerned with middle class and professional middle class families not being in the data set. Because middle class families and professional middle class families ask for and receive the same kind of help with their parenting, but they pay for it privately, right? So they pay for it through private insurance, or they pay for it out of pocket. So that means they have nannies and babysitters or au pairs. That means if they get mental health counseling, that's being paid for with private health insurance, so it's not ending up in the database. That means if they get addiction counseling, they're paying for it with private insurance or out of pocket, so it doesn't end up in the database. So the kinds of harm that happen in those families are actually not represented in the model. Does that make sense? So the false negatives problem is that if you're missing key variables, you might mistake correlation for causation. And so for folks who are not quants, just like a quick concrete example will make this really clear. So the sort of classic example of why it's important not to confuse correlation and causation is there are two things that are actually really highly correlated. They track almost exactly the same with each other, and that's ice cream consumption and shark attacks. So does that mean that like eating soft serve means that you can't swim fast enough to get away from sharks? Does that mean that sharks are attracted to dairy, right? No, it doesn't, because those things are highly correlated, but they're not actually causal, because you're missing a variable. And the missing variable in that particular equation is the temperature, right? As it gets hotter, there's more shark attacks and more ice cream eating, and that's why those things track together, right? But that doesn't mean they cause each other. So the false negatives problem with the Allegheny Family Safety Tool is that you might be seeing correlations that are not causal. You might be missing that summer variable. And there's a lot of evidence that there are things that are unique in middle class and professional middle class families that also can be part of the maltreatment equation. For example, there's good evidence that geographic isolation is highly correlated with maltreatment. But for the families in Allegheny County, they're all living in inner cities or in sort of the impoverished suburbs that ring Pittsburgh. So that variable is not going to be in the model, right? So intake workers are also really concerned that that model might be missing some really important variables in the maltreatment equation, might miss harm that might be happening because that stuff's not in the data warehouse. So let me just give you one family, the story of one family from Allegheny County. And then I'll high sign a couple of things that we should think about, and then we'll move to conversation. So one of the families I talked to in Allegheny County was Angel Shepard and Patrick Grebe. And I met them at the Attain Family Support Center, which is like a community hub where families sort of attend programs and share resources and connect with others. And both Patrick and Angel had been volunteers there for many years, working with other families who had been involved with Children, Youth, and Family Services in Allegheny County. So they didn't stand out right away because their experience is so utterly average, so characteristic of the routine, mundane indignities experienced by the white working class. They've struggled with low-wage, dangerous work, poor quality public schools and predatory online education, poor health and community violence. But Patrick and Angel are creative, involved parents. They're caring both for their own daughter, Harriet, and for Patrick's daughter's daughter, Desiree, who both live in the house along with Patrick's daughter. And the two young girls are really close in age, so they bicker a lot. And when they bicker, they put them in the get-along shirt, which is one of Patrick's sort of roomy button-downs. Patrick is this big sort of brick block of a man. I call him a Buddhist ex-biker in the book. He's really elaborate facial hair, and he's just like this wide in every direction. He's perfectly square. So he's amazing. I'm a big fan of Patrick. And so they put the two girls in one of his sort of big button-down shirts, and each girl has to put an arm through one of the arms of the shirt and the other arm around the waist of the other girl. And they have to stay in the get-along shirt until they stop fighting, even if they have to go to the bathroom. And Patrick explains that that's the threat that always works and gets them to behave. So even though they're these really sort of very hands-on, very engaged parents, they've racked up a lifetime of interactions with Children, Youth, and Family Services. So Patrick was investigated for medical neglect in the early 2000s when he was unable to afford his daughter Tabitha's antibiotic prescription after an emergency room visit. So she got worse, and he brought her back to the emergency room, and the nurse saw him and said, I know you didn't fill that prescription, and I'm calling Children, Youth, and Families. I'm going to report you for medical neglect. So he freaked out, and he picked up his daughter and kind of left the emergency room, at which point she called Children, Youth, and Families because he neglected her medical care. When Harriet was 5, that's Angel's daughter, someone phoned in a string of reports to the Child Abuse and Neglect Hotline. So those hotlines are anonymous, and the calls that came in on their family were all from an anonymous tipster who said that Harriet was running around the neighborhood unsupervised, that she was down the block teasing a dog, that she wasn't being properly clothed, fed, or bathed, that she wasn't getting needed medication. So for each call, an investigator came to the house, interviewed Harriet and Tabitha, Angel and Patrick, looked in all the cupboards and under all the beds, and requested access to the family's medical records. And then each time, finding no evidence of maltreatment, they closed the case. But each of these interactions was entered into the family's case file, which is held in the integrated data warehouse, which drives the Allegheny Family Screening Tool. So Patrick and Angel live in this kind of constant low-grade terror that there'll be another call on their family and that the algorithm will target their daughter or their granddaughter for investigation and possibly for removal to foster care. So what Angel said to me is, you feel like a prisoner. You feel trapped. It's like no matter what you do, it's not good enough for them. My daughter's now 9, and I'm still afraid that they're going to come up one day and see her out by herself, pick her up, and say, you can't have her anymore. Okay, so I just want to raise 3 quick points and then move to conversation. One thing is that one of the things that all of the designers and the data scientists and the economists who are building these systems, who I spoke to while doing the reporting for the book, one of the things that they all shared was this idea that these systems are regrettable but necessary systems for doing triage, meaning there's not enough resources and we have extraordinary need. And so there have to be systems for making decisions about who will access their basic human needs, who will access housing, food, family. One of the things I want to point out, and maybe we can talk about, is that this idea that there's not enough is actually a political ideology. It's called austerity. So I think that many of these systems are actually caught up in in today's politics of austerity, which sees that there's not, believes that there's not enough for everyone. I don't believe I believe there's enough for everyone. And because these systems tend towards austerity thinking, right? They tend to think about ways of using resources most efficiently, sort of cutting fat from already pretty skinny programs. It tends to reinforce austerity, right? So it creates this idea that you can do more and more with less and less. And I would just want to be really clear that I believe the idea that we can triage is itself a political choice, right? So many places in the world, the kinds of things I talk about in this book, not having a house, not having a place to live, losing a child because you can't afford their medication, right? Or not having enough food in the house. These things are considered human rights violations, right? And here, at least in the stories that I heard, we think of them as systems engineering problems. And I think there's something really profound about what that says about how we think about big social problems and who we are as a political community. The second point I want to make is that big data and predictive analytics are often used, are purported to identify and remove bias in these systems. So another thing that most of the designers said about these systems is like, you know what? Frontline caseworkers don't make perfect decisions. We feel like giving them better, deeper data helps them make more objective decisions. And then if you push them on it, they'll say like, look, frontline caseworkers are biased. And this is a way we don't know that this can correct the bias, but it can at least help us identify it and address it. And I want to be real, bias in public service systems has been a huge issue ever since there's been public service systems. And it largely is what blocked women of color and most never married mothers from receiving public benefits for decades and decades and decades, until a national welfare rights movement fought back against discriminatory eligibility rules. So that's a real concern. But one of the things that I found in my reporting is that in the systems that I cover, the predictive analytics or the data systems didn't actually remove bias, they just moved it, right? So it would take discretion away, for example, from frontline caseworkers and give it to the economists and the data scientists who are building the models. And there's two things that I think are dangerous about that. One is that there's built into that an assumption that the most working class, the most female, and the most diverse part of the social service, I almost said faculty, that's not the right word, workforce, thank you. The most working class, the most diverse, and the most female part of the social service workforce is somehow more biased than, and less knowledgeable than the economists and data scientists and computer scientists who are building the models. And I think that's I'm not saying that it's one way or the other. I'm just saying that's a bad assumption, right? Like we should find out more about that. The second issue around why I'm concerned with this kind of moving of bias is that by moving bias into these systems that we often believe are objective and neutral, it actually hides the bias, right? So these systems only understand bias as something that happens when discriminatory individuals make specific choices, right? So it only sees bias as an attribute of individuals. But of course, bias and injustice are systemic and structural in ways that are really profoundly world-shaping. And these systems don't actually address that kind of systemic bias at all. And I'll give you one quick example. In Allegheny County, for example, they have a real issue with racial disproportionality. That is that Black and biracial families are served more often, meaning they're investigated more often, and their children are taken out of their families more often than white families. But the county's own research actually shows that the great majority of that disproportion enters the system at the point where the community calls on the families, not at the point which intake caseworkers are making their decisions, right? So they've aimed this tool at a place where the discretion is not actually happening. Because the discretion is actually happening in a much more difficult place to deal with it. It's happening in the minds of people who see Black families and see them as inherently abusive. right? So because black and biracial families are reported 3.5 times more often than white families, right? But that's maybe a big data problem, maybe not, right? And then the third point I want to raise is one of my great fears around these systems is that they can serve, and often are serving as empathy overrides, meaning they help us deal with decisions that are just too hard for us to make as human beings. And I deeply believe that we deserve better, and we are better as a political community than to allow some of our hardest decisions, who gets housing and who stays on the street, who gets food and who goes hungry, and whose families stay together, that we find those decisions so difficult that we're outsourcing them to computers. And I think that we deserve more, and we are more than that. So I'm going to stop there and thank you for your attention. I went over my time, as I tend to do. I'm from the South, so you know I can talk. But I appreciate your time and your attention. I'm really happy to take questions and have a conversation about this stuff. So thank you.